Hey everyone, this is Chris Mooney, and welcome to Great Designer Search 3 challenge number 4. You can find the videos for all of the previous challenges up here. Let's just jump right in. This entire challenge felt a lot to me like an optical illusion. There were a number of times where I saw one thing and the judges saw another. That never really works out in my favor. And it all starts with reading this challenge as a whole. When I first read this challenge, I interpreted it as a challenge about hole filling. These cards had to fit into an imaginary, undefined, pre-established set. So we didn't know what the set was. We were supposed to sort of think of it as a generic set, but we had to make cards that could fit into whatever it was they were going into. I got really caught up on the idea of what we were and weren't allowed to design. This caused quite a few problems for me, but the biggest was that I let my art choices take a back seat to the card designs, and that was a big mistake. I thought that we were supposed to design the best cards that we could and make do with the art that was given to us, knowing that none of our options were good. The art that we were provided was slush art, meaning that a lot of it was cut from real Magic sets, specifically because the art didn't work on a Magic card. You can tell because a number of these pieces don't look like they'd be able to go on a Magic card, either because they have a weird focus or a weird color palette that makes them hard to work with. It also seemed clear that the slots we were given purposefully didn't match up well with the art provided. For instance, we got a lot of art that depicted creatures front and center, but not nearly as many creature slots to put that art into. All of this led me to believe that this challenge was kind of like that Project Runway challenge where you have to design a dress made out of trash. The art wasn't very good, and it didn't match the cards we were making. So we should just do our best to make good cards with the materials we were allowed. But when I got my judgings back, it felt like I had missed the mark completely. If I were to do this challenge again, I would simply assign each art to a certain color and card type at a glance, and then not even ever consider anything else beyond that. So let's talk about the process that I actually did use, which is that I took each slot that we had, and I assigned any of the art pieces that I could ever imagine lining up with it. Then I designed as many ideas as I could for each slot using the art I assigned. I picked the one that I liked the best, adhering to the challenge restrictions, and then I playtested those and submitted them. Pretty straightforward. Let's get on to the cards. Slot 1 was a pretty difficult one to work with because you had to somehow create a draft around uncommon for a set that didn't exist. My solution was to pick something that white does in every set, like exiling, which I thought fit this art pretty well. This is a good time to talk about my art boards. For each of these pieces, I found cards with similar art to compare side by side. Sometimes I was looking for a similar color palette, other times the framing, other times the mechanical representation, and occasionally all of them. I put a lot of these examples into my written blurb, but unfortunately I don't feel like the judges really got a chance to look at them, or if they did, they weren't very convinced by them. I made 3 major mistakes with this card. The first was that the theme I picked, exiling, wasn't prominent enough for the judges. Exiling is an effect that shows up multiple times in every set, but the problem is that most of these cards are really high demand. So in a draft, all of the exiling cards are going to get taken by players because they're high-profile removal spells. And that means that you're not really ever drafting around exile, you just sort of get some of them. That doesn't make for a good draft around if all the cards that you need are like first or second picks. The second mistake was that I made life gain the payoff. Figuring out the right payoff for this card was tricky because white's very limited in the kinds of effects it can do repeatedly. A lot of the normal ones, like making tokens or boosting creatures or tapping creatures, they just didn't fit well with the art, which left sort of gaining life as the only remaining option. For a while, I had a much stronger version of this card that actually doubled up every time you exiled something, you'd get to exile a second thing. But that was a little strong. I decided to play it safe, which left the final card very underwhelming. The third mistake was making it target 2 things. I knew I'd get dinged for the art disconnect, but after looking at Eerie Interlude that features one prominent figure but affects many, I thought that maybe I could get away with it, since it made the card play so much better. But as I said before, I probably should have just gone with more closely matching the art. Slot 2 was tough because I only really had 2 arts to choose from, and one of those 2 arts I really needed somewhere else. Designing for spikes is probably one of my weaker areas, so this was pretty tough for me. A lot of my other cards that didn't make the cut relied on very specific combat sizing interactions. Like we talked about last week, the rate was very important. The creature was no longer exciting if it cost more or if it was smaller than what I submitted. So in the end, I decided to go with the design that I thought fit the art the best and was easiest for play design to work with. Slot number 3 had 4 contenders, but all of the other ones I ended up using for other slots, which left only the most obvious art remaining. Given that this was an Amphin, it was pretty easy to justify in blue, and I even kept the tradition going by including flavor text from apparent Amphin expert Gore Muldrak. This is one of those illusion cards where, even though I clearly saw turtles with shells and no fangs and legs, not everybody does. I was a little surprised by the pushback on the size changing here. I knew that they'd mentioned the until your next turn part. That was sort of me trying to float something to see if it would pass, which it didn't. But in terms of size changing, we've started to see that more and more at common in the last few years. While those are all auras, which makes the size changing a little bit easier because you have a reminder, I thought that making a temporary change would be acceptable since it was still connected to a creature entering the battlefield, so that sort of acted as a reminder as well. But perhaps this size changing is an experiment that doesn't continue into the future. Slot number 4 didn't have too much competition, so it was all about choosing the right effect to match the art. Clearly the focus was the mage creating a creature out of the background, so I tried a number of different effects that played into that space. After testing many of them, the one that played the best was this card. Now, whenever I design cards, I spend hours searching frantically on Scryfall to make sure that no cards exist with the similar or the same rules text, but foolishly, I forgot the one place that Scryfall can't find, which is the other contestants' submissions. It was unfortunate that this happened. It was just an honest mistake, and all I can say is, sorry, Scott. Beyond that, this is another optical illusion card where I think that everyone sees something slightly different. The creature in the background, at least to me, appears to be formed out of the trees, out of the landscape, rather than being something that's invisible or illusory. My guess is that the ambiguity in this art is part of the reason that it got cut from a real Magic set in the first place. Slot number 5 had many potential arts, but again, most of them ended up getting used elsewhere, which left this blob art as my last choice, despite the green color palette. Monstrosity wasn't really necessary here, but it helped me make the card simple and flavorful. This was another card where the hole-filling nature of the challenge was a little confusing to me. Mark suggests here that I should have used an off-color green activated ability. And I actually did consider that, but I ditched it for 2 reasons. One was that random sets never have these kind of off-color activations unless they're part of a larger cycle. If I submitted a black card with a green activation to fill a hole, I kind of thought it would just get rejected immediately for that reason. The second is that it felt against the spirit of the challenge. There were a number of cards that featured palettes heavily implying 2 colors, but all the slots we were given were monocolored, and we were even instructed specifically to adhere very strictly to those requirements. Adding off-color activations would sort of undermine that restriction and allow us to basically fit any art to any card just by giving it an activated ability. While slot number 6 had a couple of options, only one of these arts really felt like a tinny mythic rare at a glance, and that was this big old demon. The ability here is inspired directly by the art, since the focus is clearly on the demon, while still featuring this warrior guy very prominently in the foreground. My one big concern was that the demon's body is red, but again, my palette exercise helped me assuage some of these fears a little bit. Melissa's change makes sense and would clean the design up quite a bit, so I have no arguments there. I think Eric and Mark's suggestion for it dying into exile makes sense to avoid abuse, but I'm honestly a little surprised by it. In the modern era of Magic, creatures very rarely die into exile as a method of avoiding recursion. All the most recent examples of creatures that die into exile do so as part of some sort of death-triggered ability. The only recent card that's exiled itself without a death trigger is Possessed Scab, presumably to prevent you from looping 2 of them in Limited. I think that Kelmoth dying into exile is a totally reasonable change, and it would definitely keep the card in check. But it's a bit of an old school fix, and I wasn't aware that that idea was sort of still in play for designers, especially since some of the most recent giant end of the battlefield effect creatures haven't had this anti-reanimation text at all. Slot number 7 was by far the hardest for me. By my estimation, there were really only 2 options for art in this slot. The one that fit red the best, this big demon, just didn't look like an uncommon. It was too epic of a creature to just be walking around any old plane. That left this dinosaur art. At a glance, this art didn't really read as red to me. But when I put it inside of a red card frame, it actually, didn't look that bad. It didn't look that out of place. The creature itself being red tinted was a big help, and reddish tan creature with a bluish backdrop is something that we've seen quite often for red cards. Plus, the art was clearly from Ixalan, where red got a good number of cards with similarly tan-leaning art. The bigger issue with this card was framing. Creatures are often front and center in their art, not hiding in the midground. I knew that this was something that I was going to have to face with my design, so to help inspire me, I looked at other art with similar framing. It became clear to me that making this art work would require playing up the relationship between the dinosaur and the temple pool that took up the rest of the art box. I went through many different options, but in the end I decided to take an effect that we'd seen a little of, which is red locking down lands, and I created a small story around a dinosaur taking over a temple to sort of tie everything together. A couple of flavor text drafts later, and I thought I ended up with a pretty serviceable card. It was a little awkward, but good. Unfortunately, all of that work that I did to research the art and tie it into the mechanic sort of went to waste. Again, I should have just gone with the straightforward route of white palette equals white card, but I got a little too creative here. Personally, I was a little surprised to see that the judges call this ability out as white. It's definitely reminiscent of a Banisher Priest style effect, but white rarely interacts with lands nowadays. Almost all white lockdown auras specifically target non-lands. Fall of the Thran and Thalia Heretical Cathar are basically the only recent examples we've had of white interacting with lands at all, and you have to go all the way back to like Ravnica or Kamigawa before you can find examples of white doing this. Who knows, maybe these comments are an indication that white will start interacting with lands a little bit more in the upcoming years, but using recent sets as an example, it was a little surprising to me that this was a white ability. Finally, I was really thrown off by this final comment from Morrow. Artifact? Creature? What? I found this comment a little confusing for a few reasons. First was that this art must be another optical illusion, because I don't see this dinosaur as metallic, but that's a matter of perspective. Second of all, this creature has to be red, which means that if it was made an artifact, it would be a red artifact creature. That, to me, isn't something that you can just throw into any random set without precedence. Colored artifacts are done very rarely, and only when they fit the very specific set that they're going into. Making this creature a red artifact would have run into the same problems of making an off-color activated ability, right? I would have assumed that a red artifact creature submitted to fill a hole would just get cut immediately. Finally, this art is clearly slush art from Ixalan, which had no artificial dinosaurs. So, in my eyes, making it an artifact would have actually gone against what the art was trying to convey with its palette, its color scheme, and its setting. So, I was a little confused by this, but you know what they say, artifact dinosaurs are in the eye of the beholder. Slot number 8 had one very obvious choice for art, but I really disliked everything that I designed for it. The idea that I liked the best, I realized, a couple minutes in that it was literally just Radiate, so I kind of just set that art aside for a bit. I wasn't really finding a lot of fruitful design space with it. The second art I tried was the Demon, which I had some okay ideas, but once I decided on using it for my Black Mythic, then that was out too. This Cultist was the third art that I tried, and I thought that it looked really cool. Dark blue art on a red card was something I always found really striking, and seems to come up quite often, so I thought that it'd be fine. Again, it seems like I should have just gone with the obvious choice. I should have picked the art that was clearly a red sorcery, and then just buckled down and brainstormed until I came up with a better design for it. I'm pretty frustrated with myself here, to be honest, because every version of this card leading up to the final submission, I specifically avoided this infinite loop that Eli pointed out. But I just completely forgot on the final card. I'm a little confused as to where Self-Infliction stands. Is it a Jenny card or not? Eric seems to think so, and I agreed when I submitted it, but Mark presents a very compelling counterargument, and now I'm not so sure. This card definitely feels like a Jenny card, because it encourages you to build an interesting deck around it using cards that you normally wouldn't put together, and turns what would normally be a downside into an upside. But I also understand how making the condition so obvious takes away from the fun of discovering how to best use it. My guess is that this is something that would need a lot more discussion and testing, but at the time it was really hard to incorporate both of these conflicting pieces of advice into my future designs. The last two slots, 9 and 10, were kind of a package deal for me. I had 4 arts, that I thought could fit into either of the slots, and I spent a lot of time just shuffling them around between the two. The first art to be eliminated was this one with the green goblin. It clearly wanted to be some kind of pump spell, but I just couldn't come up with a common pump spell that was actually interesting. I mean, basically every set in existence has had at least one pump spell with small twist, but this set didn't even have any established theme to work into, like kicker or -1/-1 counters or energy, so I just kind of set it aside. The next to go was the blob. Once I decided that Self-Infliction was going to use that cultist art, it locked the blob into the black common creature slot, so I had 2 arts left to work with. I shuffled these 2 arts back and forth quite a bit. This one was a little ambiguous. Was this merfolk following a trail? Were those runes on the ground? Was it hiding in the bushes? I tried a lot of different things, but ultimately I found that following a trail flavor clicked the best. This is probably the card that we playtested the most iterations of, each one changing very slightly to make sure that it was still balanced. Personally, I kind of liked this Mind Funeral version where you kept flipping until you hit a creature and a land, but it was impossible to word properly, and it left a lot of room open for abuse in constructed formats where you could build a deck with no creatures and just completely mill yourself out. So eventually we settled on a tamer version of the card that you saw in the final submission. I was actually kind of surprised that both Mark and Melissa said getting both cards into your hand was acceptable. The entire time I was designing this card, I was afraid of making a green divination. We've seen this type of effect to draw you 2 cards before, but it almost always does so when the second card requires a very specific card type like enchantment. Your average limited deck doesn't have enough enchantments to make it reliably draw 2 cards, and in my mind that's what made it acceptable to cost 3. Had I known that simply putting both of the cards into your hand wouldn't be seen as a color pie bend, then yeah, I agree that simply getting both cards makes this simpler and more exciting, although a little bit less flavorful, since, you don't have to follow the path to get the creature next turn. For slot number 10, I was torn between 2 competing ideas presented by this art. One about hating flyers, and one about swallowing something. While I agree that the anti-flying feel of the art is a bit more prominent, ultimately none of the designs I came up with felt quirky enough to justify the slot. After all, hyper-narrow cards you'll only play in response to specific creatures your opponents might have? That's not really the same as quirky. I agree with the judges that this card feels very white, which I believe was an unfortunate side effect of changes in playtesting. Originally, Swallowed Whole was just a straight-up fight, and then it grew your creature based on the size of the one that it ate. An enchantment that fights a creature is very clearly green, and adding a pump bonus on top of that was also pretty green. But during playtesting, the card was so powerful that we had to tune it down by having the swallowed creature return to the battlefield, which was a very flavorful nerf to the card. We ended up with a card that captured the same feeling as the original while being easier to understand, less powerful, and using the through line of toughness matters to pull the whole thing together. However, during that process, we removed so much of the green feel of the card that it just ended up too close to white design space. So there were a lot of small lessons I learned from this challenge, but the biggest lesson was actually one that I should have learned already. Way back in trial number 2, the multiple choice test, one of the most controversial questions was this one, question number 32. Without getting too into the specifics, the takeaway from this question was that Wizards of the Coast is a collaborative environment, and you should always feel free to ask questions if it'll help you do your job better. If you don't ask for help, you might create problems for everybody further down the road. I got this question wrong on the multiple choice test, and now, months later, I had to learn the same lesson again the hard way. I feel like a lot of the mistakes I made in this challenge could have been avoided if I had simply asked the judges a few clarifying questions. Does our draft around uncommon need to work in literally any set with no support? Can we do off-color activations even though they're usually part of a cycle? Why is this art labeled snakes when that Amphin is clearly holding a turtle? I was so scared of asking for help that I let myself walk into a lot of obvious traps, and with only 1 week left, I couldn't afford to let that happen again. I came into this week in 2nd place, and left in 3rd. 3rd place is pretty good, especially since the final goal of top 3 was in sight, but it wasn't a safe position. As Mark Rosewater said, it was going to be a brawl for those final top 3 spots, and I was in no position to play it safe. I was starting to really feel the pressure, because the next challenge felt like it would be one of the hardest for me. Our booster pack had to include 10 commons that showed off our creativity and originality, but simple commons were clearly one of my weakest design areas. Not only that, but Mark Rosewater specifically told me to pull out all the stops. how was I supposed to simultaneously keep it simple and pull out all the stops? Most of the commons I designed that the judges liked the best were the ones that I personally felt the worst about. Was I going to be able to create 10 of those? It was daunting, and it definitely played a huge part in what set I ended up choosing for next week. Thanks for watching, everyone. I really appreciate your support. Like, comment, and subscribe. You can find me on Twitter. We're closing in on the end here, so one way or another, we've got one more video to go, and I hope to see you then.